Bien. Après ce débat contradictoire, qui ne manquait pas de suspense, on se serait cru à une soirée électorale, je vous propose un petit retour au calme. Et pour reprendre les termes de notre programme, il s'agit d'une conversation avec un expert, le professeur Franz Pöchhacker. Alors, professeur, ou Franz, parce que vous m'avez demandé de vous appeler Franz, je vous invite à me rejoindre ici, dans notre petit salon, cosy, pour la conversation. Alors tout d'abord, les présentations. Je suis certaine qu'une partie de notre public vous connaît et suit vos publications. Je vous ai vu discuter avec plusieurs personnes à la pause. Vous êtes connus, vous êtes réputés, mais pour celles et ceux qui ne vous connaîtraient pas encore, je voudrais commencer par un mot de présentation sur votre parcours, Franz. Vous avez exercé la profession d'interprète pendant 30 ans en tant que freelance, et notamment dans le monde des médias. Mais vous êtes aussi connu pour votre longue carrière académique en tant que professeur et chercheur à la faculté d'interprétation de l'Université de Vienne, n'est-ce pas? Alors j'aimerais entamer notre petite conversation en faisant référence à un de vos récents articles, un article sur le métier d'interprète. Et il s'intitule en anglais « Interpreters and Interpreting, Shifting the Balance ». Vous y évoquez la diversification de la profession ces 50 dernières années. Or, j'entends souvent dire que ce métier subit une mutation profonde, on vient encore d'en parler lors du débat. On dit aussi, et nous l'avons entendu à l'instant, que le métier pourrait disparaître. Alors, selon vous, la technologie est-elle l'origine de ce Big Bang? Est-ce que c'est la technologie qui perturbe l'équilibre?
Is this on? Yes. Thank you. The Big Bang is a brilliant expression for this, but I think we could also go back in time and regard technology as the Big Bang at the beginning of the conference interpreting profession. So technology enabled, I think, the major growth and development of professional conference interpreting for many decades in the 20th century. And yes, technology also ushered in changes that came in already in the 1980s and 1990s when digital technologies were already becoming available to assist and support interpreters in their work. But the profession of interpreters was also beginning to change back then. Different settings, migration-related communication needs in societies, different forms of interpreting, increasing recognition of what we call community or public service interpreting. So there has been change all along, changes in the profession of interpreting on a broader scale, going beyond specifically simultaneous conference interpreting. Also, I'd like to mention the increasing recognition of sign language interpreting, a major development. And more recently, as Judith has mentioned, accessibility needs in societies which have led to the fact that the skills of simultaneous interpreters are increasingly being applied for accessibility services such as live subtitling in the media and speech-to-text interpreting. So there have been major changes affecting the interpreting profession, and not only technology, which has been around for a long time, and maybe we could say technology has been our friend as interpreters for a long time. But yes, it is a major source of change now. It's been accelerating, and I think it might help to reaffirm what some people have already said or published, that when we focus not specifically on AI, but on technology, digital technologies more broadly, there are basically three functions to which technologies can be put. The first is, and I need to stress this because as interpreters we want to be grateful for that, is the first is that technology enables us to deliver our services more effectively because we can deliver our services also remotely. I'm not only thinking of RSI, which can be problematic, as we've seen in this one video with very poor sound quality, and I would have imagined what to do if you were in the booth. So it has its drawbacks. But if we think of public service settings, video remote interpreting is a very powerful technology enabling the professional delivery of interpreting services. So a second function would be to assist interpreters in their job. We've heard a lot about that, and augmented interpretation, as you might call it, and I don't think I need to reiterate what can be done from preparation, glossary building, and even visual support based on speech recognition while interpreters are on mic, computer-assisted interpreting. That's a major, very interesting and powerful and positive application of artificial intelligence tools. And thirdly, as we've just heard, the function, the goal of replacing human interpreters.
Pour résumer, vous parlez d'un changement progressif. La technologie, ce n'est pas la source d'une sorte de Big Bang, c'est plutôt une cause parmi d'autres du changement. Et la technologie, je trouve que c'est très intéressant dans ce que vous venez de nous détailler en 3 points, la technologie, elle a aussi contribué à élargir la palette des services d'interprétation. Cette influence de la technologie et de l'automatisation sur le métier, elle me rappelle un autre de vos articles, un article qui s'intitule « Is Machine Interpreting Interpreting ?» Grande question. Et c'est une question qui me semble tout à fait légitime. Est-ce que vous pourriez résumer pour nous le résultat des recherches que vous avez menées à ce propos et nous dire aussi ce que réserve d'après vous l'avenir? Nous venons d'entendre 2 positions tranchées lors du débat précédent et nous avons promis à notre public qu'il n'y aurait pas de tabou. Alors, pour vous, comment se présente l'avenir?
Well, I start with the article. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to maybe talk about something that most of you would not really want to spend time reading. It's a very theoretical paper, but to summarize it in a few minutes. I might mention the origins of this. This came about because there was a conference session devoted to the question, is machine translation translation? And so the follow-up question for me would be, well, yes or no, but is machine interpreting, as some people have called it, is machine interpreting interpreting? And I'm fascinated by this question, even though it is not empirical and practical or futuristic, but really more theoretical. And it touches on the fact, what is our concept of translation? And how do we distinguish between translation and interpreting when we discuss this conceptual issue? And most of us are familiar with the basic distinction between translators do the written stuff and interpreters do the oral or the signed. But I think this distinction in academic quarters is not viable and it's not useful anymore. For quite some time, we have been focusing on the criterion of immediacy. What interpreters do has to do with here and now. We perform here and now, live, in real time. So the immediacy characteristic has helped us distinguish what translation is from what interpreting is. But there's another problem with machine translation nowadays, having reached amazing speeds. What you get if you require machine translation services, you get immediate output. You get pretty much immediate real-time output, more or less, with some exceptions. So we cannot really make this claim any longer, because if we say whatever translation is done immediately, that's interpreting, then that would make much of machine translation outputs forms of interpreting. We don't want that. So my point is that we need to think about a more differentiated criteria for distinguishing between translation and interpreting. Now I understand that's not the pressing issue. We want to know whether will be replaced or not. We don't want to engage in terminological debates, but maybe, wait, give me a minute, maybe there is something to it, because this links up to what we have heard in that ongoing debate. So what could be relevant criteria in distinguishing between interpreting and translation, and that is we use translation, we have been using it for many decades, in a broad sense. Anything that happens between languages, sometimes even within languages, can be referred to as translation. So it's a very powerful, broad umbrella term, and there's no need to argue machine translation is some certain form of translation as well. But we associate this very much with the manipulation of linguistic pattern, with language processing. Whereas interpreting, the term interpreting is much closer, of course, also to the sense of understanding and interpretation in the hermeneutic sense. And that is what gives an initial signal that there might be something different about what we understand by interpreting. Interpreting involves meaning making, meaning processing, not manipulating linguistic patterns.
Oui, mais si vous me permettez une petite question, est-ce que traduire, vous dites meaning making, qui serait lié à l'interprétation, mais est-ce que traduire en soi, ce n'est pas aussi créer du sens? J'ai rencontré tout à l'heure une traductrice à la pause, et je suis sûre qu'elle sera d'accord avec moi pour dire qu'elle aussi, dans son travail, elle crée du sens.
Good point, thank you. Well, I thought we're speaking to interpreters, we can badmouth the other guys, the translators. No, you're quite right, of course.
Il y a des traducteurs dans la salle. Hein. Je ne vais pas leur demander de laver la main, mais il y en a, il y en a.
We're all, yeah. No, seriously, of course, translation involves understanding, grasping meaning, and re-expressing it. But my point is that in any translation, any human translation is cognitive processing. But cognitive processing has different degrees of complexity. We learn that from the evolution of scholarship in cognitive science. For a long time, cognitive processing was viewed as information processing. Information going in, the decoding, encoding model, and that is then very close to simple linguistic information processing. Whereas cognition, in more recent theoretical approaches, the view of cognition focuses that cognitive processing depends on human perception, on human physical bodily expression. They call it embodied. Communication is embodied. And this embodied expression is embedded in a situation, in a situational context, which is again a source of perception for these embodied communicators. So yes, any language involves a degree of embodiment, but there is a difference in degree. And written language has as a function to be less dependent on context, more decontextualized, more general, more useful in many different situations. And that's why I think we can single out interpreting as something that happens live in a situated, embodied manner where there is mutual interpersonal perception and reaction. And this interactivity, I think, justifies that we distinguish this particular activity as something special in the broad field of translation, something special that we label with the English expression interpreting.
Okay. Bon, vous insistez sur l'importance de la contextualisation dans ce que vous venez de nous dire, situatedness notamment, et la valeur ajoutée que l'être humain présente pour saisir tout ce contexte. Mais au fond, le contexte, est-ce qu'il est nécessaire à n'importe quel type d'interprétation? Autrement dit, et je suis bien consciente de jeter un pavé dans la mare ici, c'est volontaire, est-ce qu'il y a selon vous des formats de réunion qui se prêtent à l'interprétation automatique par une machine, parce que cette notion de contexte est pratiquement absente, ou plus du tout pertinente?
Well, now we get to the difficult bit, right? But basically, I only need to rephrase what I have just said in more theoretical terms. The more communication is prepared, scripted, relying on written language, decontextualized, maybe read out with any deviations, in a very formal situation of communication, the more this would lend itself to processing also by what I would not call machine interpreting, but speech-to-speech translation, automatic speech-to-speech translation. But I think this touches on the way we conduct formal communication in different settings, because the reverse side is the more we want to engage in spontaneous interpersonal communication, the more we depend on the faculties, the talent, and the special skills of human interpreting. So yes, unfortunately, as an interpreter, I've been in many meetings where written texts were read out at such high speed that I think this is overwhelming for me. Maybe a machine could do better in terms of accuracy, not in terms of empathy, being persuasive, focusing on the point the speaker wishes to make. Interpreters can do that, machines cannot, but it depends on the kind of human communication that we value and that we appreciate for its unique live performativity.
Donc si je peux essayer de conclure à partir de vos propos, est-ce que cela signifie que l'avenir de l'interprétation, il dépend surtout de l'authenticité de la communication? Et c'est peut-être un choix politique aussi, hein. Au fond, n'est-ce pas l'importance que nous attachons à la communication qui va déterminer si nous pouvons confier l'interprétation à une machine ou rester dépendant d'une interprétation par des êtres humains? Parce qu'en tant qu'interprète, et je suis interprète plusieurs jours par semaine, en cabine, nous sommes déjà confrontés à un défi qui est la montée en puissance de l'anglais international, hein, le globish. Mais d'après vous, est-ce qu'il y a une plus grande menace encore pour la profession?
I think it's important that you bring in the issue of globish, of using English as an international lingua franca, because that's another, we tend to focus on AI now very much, but that is another major force of change that has been affecting the conference interpreting profession, especially freelance interpreting. So maybe rather than speaking about human versus machines, we should bring in several scenarios: multilingual communication relying only on English as a lingua franca, or human interpreting, or using machines for speech-to-speech translation. And one thing is feasibility. We want to find out, we should know better where the limits are now, not in a couple of months, as Jürgen said, but now or in the near future where this is needed. So the one point that I'd like to make as an academic, how could I not, is the need for research. We debate, we have opinions, we have hunches, we can be persuaded by argument, but where is the evidence? Where are the research findings that allow us to draw conclusions? And I was very happy to hear about Sally's work in the Council of Europe, testing some of these platforms, seeing where the limits are, what the potential is. So one thing that's needed, I think, is research. And I find it quite incredible that somebody could market these tools and make good money without having prior testing and transparent conclusions drawn from empirical data. Because if we did this in drug development, for instance, we invent a new drug and without any clinical testing, we throw it out and see what works. That's the same attitude. I think we need systematic testing and research, and we have universities in charge of not only training the future generations of interpreters, but also doing research on interpreting. And we have resources, we're available. So I think that's one important point. We need to look into this, not be scared or look away, but to engage with this research challenge. And the second, but if we have established that there is a certain degree of feasibility, then to conclude comes a more difficult challenge, and that has to, well, if it is fit for purpose to a certain extent, if it is a certain margin of error, good enough for some settings, like healthcare settings maybe, because we cannot afford to pay for interpreters in healthcare systems, or in legal settings, possibly asylum settings where the politicians try to not invest much more money because of political and ideological considerations. Who decides which scenarios, in which scenarios this will be appropriate for use? So ultimately, it will have to do with the value we attach to communication, to human rights, to power in societies. Who gets the human interpreters? Who gets the valuable, high-quality interpreters? They say, well, when it's high stakes, we need the humans. Who decides what's high stakes? If there's a cancer patient having a discussion with a doctor, is this high stakes, or is this just a single case, not as important as diplomatic negotiations, for instance, or media press conferences? So I don't have answers to that, but I enjoy the fact that these questions can be raised and discussed in this meeting.
Eh bien, Franz, je trouve que c'est une remarquable conclusion. Vous avez parlé des enjeux et des décisions qui doivent s'en suivre, au niveau politique notamment, autour de valeurs. Donc, ce sont des mots qui me parlent, qui parlent probablement à notre public. Et si vous avez envie d'en reparler, eh bien, je vous propose non pas de poser des questions maintenant parce que le temps file, mais de nous rencontrer, de rencontrer Franz lors de ce qui nous attend à l'issue de cette conférence. N'hésitez pas à poursuivre la discussion. Et pour l'heure, je vous remercie chaleureusement, Franz.
Bravo.
Désolée, il n'y avait pas de temps. Mesdames et messieurs, ceci nous amène à la fin du premier jour de notre conférence. Et je voudrais remercier chaleureusement tous les intervenants qui ont pris la parole cet après-midi, en salle ou en ligne. J'espère que toutes et tous, vous avez apprécié comme moi la richesse des débats. Et je cède la parole à Andrea pour la conclusion.
So there is still a lot more to come tomorrow. So please join us then. We will be back here at 9:30 Brussels time for another action-packed half day of interesting discussions to look forward to. One practical point for those of you in the room, please hold on to your badges because you'll need them to enter the building tomorrow. And that's about all we have time for today, except that we really want to thank our interpreters in the booth, but also over here. As a quick aside, can I just say, they're much more fun to look at than the people like us who work in the booth. And thank you to our technicians, to our logistical support, all those who have made this possible, working behind the scenes. And now do join us for our cocktail. Time to let your hair down. Mingle, network, and to your heart's content. And for those who are joining us from home, well, have a great evening and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Needs to be able to speak confidently, articulately,